Hello and welcome to our Threat Hunting Basics webcast with LogRhythm. On this webcast, to a surprise of everybody, Paul is actually here. Say hi, Paul.
I made it. I'm here.
Yay! And we have AC from LogRhythm, our sponsor for this webcast. Hooray!
Hey.
And me. So, all right. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some cool things that Paul and I have found interesting over the past couple of weeks whenever we're talking about threat hunting and getting ready for a threat hunt. And then also we're going to hand it over to LogRhythm. And LogRhythm slides are really, really cool. They talk about a lot of event IDs, specific things to look for that are indications of different compromises, escalation, different programs executing. So it's a really cool webcast. So thank you so much. And let's kick it off. All right, so one of the first things that we like to do for threat hunting preparation, believe it or not, has literally nothing to do with threat hunting at all. Basically, what can you do to identify what types of command and control are allowed outbound from your organization? Now, the reason why this is critical is the fewer ports and the fewer doors you have open for a bad guy to get a command and control session out of your environment, it reduces the total amount of places that you end up looking to try to identify command and control leaving your environment. For example, in this particular set that we have set up from the pen test that I think Joff did this one. He went through and created a number of different backdoors: DNS, CAT, PowerShell backdoors, Meterpreter, reverse TCP, reverse HTTP, all of these different types of malware specimens using different types of command and control on a variety of different ports. And at the top, you can see that it was able to make an egress connection leaving on port 21, 22, 80, 443, and 8080. That's giving a lot of ground for a bad guy to be able to blow through those particular ports to establish a command and control server in some horrible country, someplace that you don't want your data actually going to. Now, as you do this type of testing, it's also important to look at the type of testing that you can do to cross-reference the MITRE attack matrix. Yeah, Paul.
So I just want to go back to that other slide where you talked about testing the ways in which an attacker could basically make a network connection outside of your network. Are there like standard tools and techniques? Like, can I just download something, drop it in my network, and it'll test a bunch of things? I remember Pony Express's devices actually used to kind of do that by default, right? Are there tools you recommend for defenders to do that?
One of the things that you can do is really quite easy to do. Just set up a server on like DigitalOcean, right? Mm-hmm. And then simply do a port scan of that server and identify which ports were allowed to make a connection all the way through.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's really easy for TCP, right, but it's not quite so easy for services like DNS.
Sure.
That's why tools like DNSCAT can actually do that covert channel detection because it requires that full protocol to be utilized.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Very cool. Now, Paul, as you know, with any webcast that we do, it's impossible for me to get through the webcast without talking about the MITRE attack framework. Mm-hmm. Absolutely love this framework because it's giving defenders the capability to sit down and say, what is the total set of different techniques we see for persistence, privilege escalation, defensive evasion, discovery, lateral movement, execution? What are the different techniques that are utilized? And can we actually detect these various techniques being used in our organization? Now, there are some tools out there like Unfetter from the NSA and Caldera from MITRE that allows you to automate a tremendous amount of this. And this is going to be something we're going to talk about a little bit later with LogRhythm and AC when he starts talking about it, is you can actually go through and test these things. And you can very quickly identify in a tool like LogRhythm whether or not these things are being detected. And in fact, we would encourage anybody that has a defensive network to actually do that.
Hey, John, there's a couple of more that cropped up, actually. So you mentioned Caldera. Did you mention Chris Gates at Uber also created?
That's Meta.
Meta.
It's uber-common/meta under GitHub.
And then there was the Atomic Red team from Red Canary. And then a new one that actually I met the person last week that is spearheading the project at Endgame actually created one for testing against the MITRE attack framework. And I believe we'll be releasing that open source as well. I actually have a slide on that in my presentation I gave the other day in Orlando and learned that Endgame had one as well. So there's increasingly more and more vendors and open source projects and vendors releasing open source projects to support the MITRE attack framework, which I thought was just fantastic.
And I think that we've been talking about it for a while. This is threat intelligence being used correctly, looking at all the different tactics that are used, not just for a specific threat actor, but being able to look at the tactics that are consistently used across multiple threat actors, and then detecting your ability, or basically gauging your ability to detect those capabilities. Fantastic. That's amazing.
And just to your point, actually, Paul, I think it's really, positive to hear that kind of shift in mindset of, the defenders kind of going out and performing active defense and referring to these freely available resources, and getting really good and quick value just by keeping it simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Some other things that we recommend, and AC and I were talking about this before the webcast. I am a really big fan, and Paul, you've been talking about it for a long time, of inventory, right? Can you actually inventory all of your systems? Can you inventory the processes, the services that are running? Now, this isn't specific to something like log analysis or SIM or a detection capability, but whenever you have an alert that is generated, if you have a corresponding inventory that you can quickly identify that asset that is generating anomalous behavior, and you can quickly drill down to identify what are the drivers on that system, what are the ports that are being used on that system, what are the accounts that are on that system, and so on. It makes the incident response next step process as part of identification so much easier. And there's a couple of tools that we absolutely love. System Configuration Manager, or System Center Configuration Manager, is a tool that most all enterprises already have. You could also run something like Tanium as well. You could even use PowerShell. Someone that's been on our show, and we love all the work that he's done over the years, is Dave Hull. And he released a tool a long time ago that he's been keeping up to date called Consa. And Consa will do stacked analysis of all of your different workstations. So you aren't doing an individual workstation by workstation lookup for atomic indicators of compromises. You can stack all of the different processes on all of your different systems together. And by doing a stacked analysis and doing a long tail analysis, it makes it much more efficient to try to identify deviations in your environment, rather than trying to categorize every single thing that's running, all the processes, all the programs, all the services, and looking at each individual system in and of itself. By stacking them together and identifying what processes are common across an entire environment, what processes are unique within that environment, it allows you to identify those outliers very quickly. Now, by and large, Consa requires PowerShell 3.0, but that should be pretty easy with most modern Windows 10 systems. It should be at least at that version. Full functionality, you have to install handle and auto run sysinternals from Microsoft and put that on a file share somewhere in your environment where all of your systems can access those files. Then you're going to have to install log parser on the admin machine that's launching the scripts. And then you need to make sure that Windows Remote Management is enabled with Windows RM Quick Config. Then you're able to log on to every single one of the workstations and do stacked analysis. Now, here's a stacked analysis in a quick lab run, Paul, where we had 10 systems, and all 10 systems had these processes running on them. And it was able to tell us the executables and the MD5 hashes. Now, when every single system in your environment is running the exact same program, that either means one of two things. Either that program is pretty normal in your environment, or you're so completely compromised that you should probably just shut off the network connection to the internet and go to sleep for a while. We usually don't see malware that spreads to every single system and environment. So this is not really something that we would expect to see in most incidents that we're working. So by and large, you can take all of these programs that are installed on every single workstation in your environment. You can say these are most likely normal. This allows you to baseline what is normal without actually having to go to each individual system and baseline what is normal manually. Now, what does Consa actually pull? It'll pull information like netstat for network connection, DNS cache, process handles, WMI, log user assist values, which is cool. I'll talk about that here in a second. Service fails, service triggers, different event filters, connections, event consumer, auto runs, PowerShell profiles, temporary directory listings, and local administrators. So it makes it very, very, very easy for you to do this type of analysis across multiple systems and correlate and do a stacked analysis on every single one of these computer systems in an automated fashion. Now, here's the long tail on these systems. long tail on these systems, we saw that every single system will have a DNS entry for itself. That is normal. But we also saw that we had two systems that had DNS entries for truly evil 550 and mail.trulyevil.550. That would be an anomalous domain. Also for counts, for the user accounts, we had the IE user accounts, domain accounts, administrator accounts, and only one of the systems had my malicious support elite account, the 31337 account. Once again, these discrepancies show up very clearly in an environment when doing a stacked analysis, and when you do it this way, rather than trying to analyze every single system. Now down below, you see the CT value. These are all the single entries for programs that were executed by an individual. Of course, we see log parser because that's running on the analysis system. Now, the Windows Defender one was very interesting to me. I had one of my systems that had a firewall enabled, and I disabled that firewall or modified the firewall to allow Windows Remote Management in. And because I interacted with Windows Firewall, it actually showed the log user assist value that I had interacted with Windows Defender. Also, we see fondue, which shows up on a number of Windows systems from time to time. But more importantly, you can see that we have the users, administrators, downloads, MSF. That would be my malware in this specific environment. So instead of trying to find a specific signature and trying to find bad programs doing bad things, I instead will focus on what are the things that are only happening on one or two systems in my entire environment. The other tool,
John,
Paul, that we have to have. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I just had a question based on the console tool that you just described, which admittedly I had not heard of before. I was looking into, and I haven't tested it hands-on yet, but was it Facebook that did OS Query? Did they release OS Query?
Yes,
as open source.
So, yeah.
So could you use OS Query? And I know there's another project called Collide that when I polled our Twitter audience for Security Weekly, they said a lot of people were using Collide plus OS Query. Could you accomplish some of the same things that you talked about, some of the same goals as Consul provides with something like OS Query?
Absolutely, you could. It would require custom queries on the database on the back end. You would have to basically have to sort every single record that exists for processes and display the count associated with them, which honestly is not that difficult if you know what you're doing. In fact, as far as inventory, using those two different tools, the big one that I see actually used in many environments is actually Google's GER. They actually do the same type of kind of baselining of systems for free as well. Once again, back-end database, you can do that type of querying and stacked analysis with simple SQL queries.
Awesome.
Hey, John, just on that last slide, one thing that I found quite interesting is the fact that in the results there, you've got the bottom, I guess, 10 results, for example, and then on a couple of the other pictures, you've got the top. And that's kind of relevant to what I'll be talking about in the realms of hunting and kind of knowing and understanding your infrastructure and what's normal. So it's interesting that you've got two different outputs there, but one would only show up if it's a top X and one might only show up if it's a bottom X. So that's
absolutely
like it.
The next tool, this is something that we were talking about too, AC. We were talking about Logon Tracer, and this is JP Cert. And JP Cert has been doing an amazing amount of research and development over the past few years. They've just absolutely rocked it. And what Logon Tracer allows you to do is ingest EVTX files from your domain controller, and it'll automatically identify authentication in your environment and show you the top communicators in your environment. So on the right-hand side, you can see the administrator account is being used, and then the Machida Kanagawa account is being used as well on multiple systems. So on this graph, you can see administrators authenticated to 4 workstations. It's the kind of the cross in the middle. And Machida is actually authenticated to 2 different workstations as well. So being able to do that type of drawing of which accounts are logged into which systems allows you to identify multiple concurrent logins from potentially compromised accounts. Now, this is basically the heart of user analytics, user behavioral analytics. And there's a lot of products out there that do that. We'll talk about LogRhythm here in just a few moments that also supports this type of capability as well. But being able to identify accounts that are quote unquote behaving badly is an amazing step in the right direction. Now, one of the differences for a tool like this versus a nice automated tool is this is a single shot tool. You have to export the EVTX files, upload it into this logon tracer utility, and then it has to actually graph it for you. It's not something that's actually working continuously and generating alerts on the back end. But when you're doing threat hunting, it's a nice little tactical tool that you can use rather than doing it at a strategic level. Now, for network setup, Paul and I are big fans. We've already done a couple of webcasts last week about this, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But when you're talking about network setup and trying to detect network anomalies, one of the big things that we see missing from a large number of organizations today is actually having a span port on their egress traffic, where they can basically see pre-network address translation, where all of their systems on the inside of their network are going outside of the network on the internet. So if you have one compromised computer system with a little ick icon on it that's communicating to the bad guy or bad gal system on the outside of the internet, you need to be able to get those RFC 1918 IP addresses for non-routable internal IP addresses. And you need that because if there's something acting malicious or even just interesting, you need to be able to identify exactly what the IP address of that asset is. And that requires you to have a span port, pre-network address translation, out of your firewall to be able to dump that into something for free like Bro or Rita. And Bro and Rita work very well together as well. So why would you use Bro? Well, to be honest, speed, right? It's a very fast tool. It has great user support, big user base, and also the timestamps are consistent. And that's key whenever you're trying to do any type of analytics for frequency and beaconing detection, to be able to identify weird communication pairs leaving your environment. And this is all part of going away from signature-based detection. And that's one of the reasons, honestly, whenever Paul and I spend time talking about vendors that come on to Security Weekly, we do spend a lot of time talking about whether or not we want a vendor to be part of that. And anytime we have a vendor that spends a tremendous amount of time talking about how they can do their job for you, that's not really a vendor we're interested in. Whenever you have vendors that come on and say, well, we can actually assist you in doing your job and get you the data that you need so that you can make good determinations about what's happening, well, that's fantastic as well. Rita is free. We've talked about it many times for doing frequency analysis and beaconing detection in an environment. You can download it. This is the Git repository where you can pull it down. And then final housekeeping that I would like to add in, clear out ads. Have some type of ad blocking in your environment so you do not have to sift through terabytes of ad connections, trying to identify potentially malicious connections. Regardless of whatever tool you're using, the more you can clean up that signal on the wire, the more effective your threat hunting is actually going to be. So please try to find a way to block ads either by using the Cisco Umbrella project or OpenDNS, whatever one you can actually use. Pi-hole is another good one. Paul, I believe that we've had a bunch of them recommended over the past couple of years, but there's a number of them out there.
It's interesting in my presentation where I talk about open source tools in the enterprise that are used for security. I cover the Pi-hole project and how we use that actually here in Security Weekly, and how that tied into a bunch of technical segments that you can go back in the archives and watch. And all of that is free. And essentially, Pi-hole was made for a Raspberry Pi, but you can just dump that on, like you said, a DigitalOcean droplet and be off to the races. Which is great. There's, also commercial solutions. I want to also go back to, some of your kind of network monitoring stuff. I know LogRhythm has Netmon Freemium, which is pretty awesome. The Security Onion, I didn't realize how great that project was, and I spend a lot of time,
especially now with
like I spent a lot of time in my talk talking about my experiences with the experimental version. And just how quickly I was able to, and Netmon Freemium did the same thing. In fact, Greg Foss came here in our studio and set up the Netmon Freemium and was like giving people demos and showing them stuff that you could identify. And that's essentially all hunting. And all of these tools are free. And when we look at where you can sniff that data from, there are so many tools that just out of the box give you great insights into your network. I know that for some of our Skype machines, we talked about looking at connections. I was like, wow, they're connecting to lists that are on some kind of threat list or blacklist. And it's because they make so many connections to so many different systems in the way that Skype works. That stuff bubbled to the surface pretty quickly. in my environment. So
well, and I think that that's going to be a sea change in the way that we actually approach security as well. Instead of trying to find tools that actually do our jobs for us, but actually moving towards tools that enable us to get information and really solid intelligence out of what is happening on the network in our environment is really where things have to go.
Yeah. And I will say too that when I did use, and I still have it set up in the studio here, monitoring our network. And as you said, John, the Security Onion, the experimental version, has a full elk stack. And Kibana is the web interface. And I had used that for the first time a couple of weeks ago. And it gives you some interesting statistics, but like it doesn't necessarily answer all of my questions, being kind of an analyst in this field. Since 2001 when I started monitoring networks, it doesn't directly answer all my questions. I end up like clicking around going, that's interesting, but it doesn't give me enough insights, which is why I'm very interested in what Andrew has to say and what some of the other tools. It's also why I was kind of bugging you over the past couple of weeks to be like, look what Rita can do. Like Rita can just answer my questions that I want to ask of my network, which is great.
We got to set a little bit of background. So Paul calls us up, just so you guys know, and he's like, Rita's not installing on Security Onion. And we're like, Rita does install on Security Onion. He's like, it's not working. It's crashing. It's crashing. It's crashing. It's crashing. And he's sending a stack trace. So we're like, holy crap, it's actually crashing. We come to find out that Paul's got this super secret sauce, experimental, non-public release of the Security Onion that's completely different from what we installed.
Completely different.
So
I will say the stable version of Security Onion, I followed the instructions for Rita. Dude, I had a report in like 5 minutes. Like it works flawlessly. As soon as I went to the experimental version of Security Onion, they call it experimental for a reason, right? It's not fully baked yet. So then I tried like a beta version of Rita, and I sent notes to like both developers. I'm like, you guys will figure it out. I'm confident that you will. I got to move on to other things, but it'll get figured out. And when it does, it'll be awesome. But obviously, there are experimental versions of both of these projects that we talked about. To be safe, use the stable version. And if I didn't break it, believe me, it probably works pretty well because it's pretty good at breaking stuff. It works
and that's
great.
The world of open source, right?
Yes, absolutely.
All fun and games. Now, with that, a lot of what you talked about, I went through my slides kind of fast. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I went through my slides kind of fast is AC has got all kinds of slides that he's going to talk about now. So we're going to kick it over. You ready to share your screen?
I am indeed, sir.
I'm so glad that you're sharing your screen and not a hideous picture of me. By the way, we can see your video box in Skype because Skype is kind of dumb about.
Oh, there you go.
There we go. All right, we're good. And with that, we'll hand it over. Andrew is going to take over. Andrew, tell us a little bit about your role at LogRhythm before we get started, though.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a threat research engineer. I'm based over in the UK, and I've been at LogRhythm for just over 5 years now. So my general background is quite varied, actually. So I kind of started out doing hardware support somewhere around 17 years ago. Kind of moved up to kind of sysadmin, field engineer, bit of consulting, kind of then specialized in enterprise application level support and a bit of infrastructure. And just through LogRhythm, really, my career's kind of ended up doing threat research in our labs department. So my kind of day-to-day role is quite varied. You kind of touched on a few points earlier, John. Part of our role as a team is to develop new content. So that would be, for example, UEBA and also rules to do with network monitor, as well as things like obviously researching the threat landscape, malware analysis and triage. And well, I'm sure you guys can relate, you wear many hats. So it's quite a varied and dynamic role.
I want to, before you start, Andrew, just talk about UEBA, because having spent time with over 40 vendors in the past week and a half or so, it's really a feature. And I don't want our audience to think that it's not a valid feature because they've seen it in the marketing of so many other security vendors. There are people that get it right. There are people that get it wrong. But it is a very valid feature. And when done correctly, such as a LogRhythm solution, it's an extremely valuable piece of information to have in your arsenal, especially as a threat hunter. And that's a trend that I've seen when UEBA first came out. There's like whole startups that said, like, this is what we do. largely those have been swallowed up. Larger companies such as LogRhythm are like, well, no, that's a feature. Like we have that data, we can build it, and are doing it very effectively. And it's one aspect of threat hunting that you should absolutely be paying attention to.
And that's a really good point, Paul, because funnily enough, we were developing. Originally, our module was called the user threat detection module, and we were going for a bit of a revamp and a bit of internal housekeeping, thinking about ways to update that particular module. And just around that sort of time, this whole UEBA buzz kind of hit the industry, and we kind of, as part of our review, kind of came to a realization that we actually already do UEBA out of the box.
Right.
But it kind of helped us to kind of focus in some areas, but coupled with things like cloud AI and true identity and, various correlation rules that we have in that particular module, and coupled also with things like JP Cert, the MITRE attack matrix, that's when you can really benefit from, not just UEBA and having that work properly, but also kind of complementing the new kind of resources that become, quite widespread over recent months.
Yeah, and I think it's really basic questions or common sense questions that you're asking of your security analytics solutions. If a user successfully logs in from two different locations, that's a pretty easy thing to spot. And like you said, Andrew, we could spot that a long time ago. We didn't call it UEBA back then, but that was an event that someone would want to pay attention to.
Absolutely. And actually, going back to the just on the John slide, he mentioned about inventory. And again, it was just something that we do out of the box in terms of entities. We have, it's one of the very first phases of our kind of deploying our solution to our customers is to define your entities, deciding where your assets live, almost kind of like a logical structure, if you like, of your organization. And by that, you're able to then quickly correlate on things like identity or what that device type might be. And that's going to then subsequently make life easier when it comes to, proactive threat hunting and kind of active defense and so on.
Awesome.
All right, so shall I get started?
Yes, please do.
Okay.
Sorry.
So, quick talk on threat hunting. I'll some of these slides a little bit shouldn't take too long to get through. If my PowerPoint will actually wake up and respond. Sorry, guys. Can you see my screen? Oh, there
yes, we got it.
All right. So obviously this is probably a bit of a given. So why are we hunting? So it's kind of common knowledge these days that hackers and underground auctions, as well as APT, nation state sponsored attackers, targeting organizations. One thing that particularly rang true for me personally was, I don't know if you guys remember actually. So I think it was a couple of years ago, there was a company called the Hacking Team, and they were basically a government spying agency. And they basically got hacked, and the hacker pasted how he got in on Pastebin, and it was really interesting read. But he claims that actually out of the most of the Fortune 500 companies that exist, there's pretty much botnets or RDPs that exist within there, and that kind of reminisced with me that this is there are to this day still companies that just think they're a little bit untouchable and that this stuff isn't happening. But I don't know if you guys can remember that story at all.
I do, and I always found it, and it's something that I don't think we talk about enough, but there's an underground market for that level of access into an organization. If you've got stealthy access into some company, especially here in the US, like there are whole groups out there that's what they do, and then they just sell that to someone else. Yeah,
exactly. RDP, servers for sale, readily available and accessible in an instant. Just pay me my Bitcoin and away we go.
Yep.
All right. So kind of where this will kind of hopefully start making sense in a little bit. So I just want to touch on the pyramid of pain. So David Bianco came up with this kind of concept of the idea behind this graphic being that the pyramid of pain is just a way of measuring the usefulness of your threat intelligence. So, traditionally, Things like IPs and hashes and domain names, for instance, have a very short shelf life. So, if you're able to effectively try and prevent tools, for instance, from hitting your network, then you're going to potentially quite drastically reduce the likelihood of the attacker getting back in, or at least trying to kind of thwart their attempts later down the line. So kind of how this fits in, and just as a quick example, so taking a simple IP version 4 address, most modern day operating systems, you can put in a hex or a decimal or an octal or even a combination into a web browser and still reach, as an example here, Security Weekly or whatever the domain name is. So the idea, going back to the pyramid of pain, is that these malware authors can quite easily and readily availably update C2 infrastructure. All it takes is someone to upload a file, potentially a suspicious file, to VirusTotal, and that in itself could trigger a notification to the organized crime group that are responsible, and then they may change their hash or IP addresses or tear down a domain name and so on. So that's where the idea of maturity models come in, and I'm kind of covering off some of the reasons as to kind of just to put this into context, why some of this is relevant to threat hunting. Because, for example, in the realms of maturity models, you don't have to be on the kind of far right end of the scale. And just for instance, the graphic on the left is the COBIT maturity model. The one on the right is the LogRhythm's interpretation of of their own kind of maturity model. And I'm sure there's other maturity models that exist out there, but the general kind of consensus is the higher up the spectrum that you are, the more mature your security posture is, then the easier your life's going to be with threat hunting. But that's not to say that you can't necessarily do threat hunting unless you're at the far end. I mean, even if you have no security tools at your disposal, it's still possible to do threat hunting, even just by using static logs on Windows, Linux servers. But of course, that process is going to be very manual, and it's going to take you a considerable amount of time.
Yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. And we talk about when you're ready to implement some kind of solution or some kind of tactic or technique. And I think largely what John will agree with me here, I believe, is that like anyone and everyone should be hunting. It's not an activity where you're like, well, I have to have like all this other stuff in place, or I have to have, all this stuff in place over here. Like anyone can just start hunting today. Like right now, like after this webcast, everyone listening, you can go do some hunting in your environment. And I think that's an important point for this presentation.
Absolutely. And actually, we ran a similar webinar earlier in the week, and we did a quick poll as to do people think, so the participants decided to vote whether threat hunting was a buzzword, or whether they're actively going out and already hunting. And I genuinely believed that the majority would say that it was maybe a bit of industry hype. Yeah. To my surprise, I think the majority were actually already going out and hunting. So that was quite kind of refreshing to hear that, I thought. So moving on. So just a few other reasons to hunt. So interestingly, one of the things that I've picked up on just in my time over the years in this space is that, a common kind of problem that many companies face is staff retention. So quite often I've seen people leave great companies because they're just not getting fulfilled. And hunting has got a really good kind of almost kind of HR benefit. Because your typical blue team can become the purple team, and maybe they don't have kind of a red team background, but it's a perfect opportunity to kind of fully engage your resources and get them more involved in kind of thinking like an adversary, thinking like an attacker, putting on that kind of black hat momentarily, and kind of understanding and figuring out how they might want to get into that organization, because people don't often think of it like that, unless of course they have come from a pen testing background, but you can't obviously assume everyone has. Obviously the other reasons to as another benefit, so doing hunting obviously increases your visibility. So in the example that I'll get to, kind of towards the end of this presentation, is just an example of, you could start hunting for something that could be, what you might think would probably not turn up any results. And it could, in fact, turn up something malicious, but it also could turn up something completely benign and may just increase your visibility into maybe a, performance issue on your network or your server or an application reliability problem. So, just by hunting alone, you instantly start touching on areas of your network that you may not otherwise touch on unless that system just happens to go down, for instance. And again, kind of not to repeat this too much, but fully utilizing all of your security tools and increasing your return on investment. And I think that hunting really plays a part in this because, every company has got, quite a collection of tools, but quite often they're just not getting the real value from it. So hunting really comes into its own because you really do start touching on not only, the search capabilities, but also things like ticketing, case management, and so on. And also, just last point on this slide, traditionally, and maybe not always, but incidents or instant responders typically are working, to kind of tight deadlines. They usually operate under kind of highly pressurized environments and having to provide, answers and updates to C-level and management and so on. The good thing with hunting is it doesn't have to necessarily be under that kind of intensity of pressure. So threat hunting is more likely, and not necessarily guaranteed even, but it's more likely to unravel in points of interest along the way.
Andrew, and one thing you made me think of when you went through all the points on that slide was, I think another benefit is that as an incident responder, oftentimes you find yourself responding to an incident because someone else found it, an external entity, the FBI. Someone else in the organization says, well, we can't get to the internet and it's because of some security incident, and you spend time responding to that. But when you are the hunter and you find a problem that nobody else knew about because there was no other indicators other than you spent some time and found it in the network, and you bring it to other people, you're like, look, that system is compromised. No one else really noticed this, but like when I did my investigation, like this is compromised. It increases your visibility in the organization as a security person and develops trust within the organization because they're like, oh, wow, like they found out something and we got it fixed before it caused any major issues. And I think that's important as well.
Totally as well. And also, Paul, but, as you know, during incident response, quite often, the forensic kind of approach, particularly if maybe that incident might result in, ending up going to a court of law. The forensic process has to be very precise, high precision, high efficacy, and so on. But with hunting, it's not so, it's not so stringent, and there's a little bit more flexibility, I guess.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. So can't have a talk about kill chains, but just very quickly. If depending on your own interpretation, we've all probably heard of the Lockheed kill chain. The graphic in the bottom part of the screen is the LogRhythm's implementation. But really, how that kind of plays a part in threat hunting is because you can use these kill chains to think about what might be relevant to you and your organization. So, for example, maybe you're only interested in data being exfiltrated out of your organization. So therefore, that would be a good place to start. And it kind of goes back to what John covered earlier, talking about the MITRE attack matrix, which I believe is on my next slide as well. But, this is a really good breakdown of just being able to decide, where to begin. I think there could be a bit of a perception, possibly, that, threat hunting is maybe a little bit overwhelming. But it really doesn't have to be. And again, John, you said it in one of your slides, but, just keeping things simple is sometimes all that's needed. The final point on this slide is the kind of the LogRhythm equivalent of our kill chain, which we've kind of called the attack lifecycle. We actually have numerous rules that kind of fit into those particular phases of the attack lifecycle. So, for example, not only could you only for example, focus on the exfiltration phase, but you might then specifically pick out a detection rule. So I'll use the one in the bottom right corner, so mass files deleted by admin. So you could then use that rule, just the simple name of the rule, as the direction for, you know, an example of a hunt, and then go off and go and do your research and then proactively go out and do the hunt. So just a few points to touch on here. So challenges. So the idea of threat hunting perhaps isn't, I mean, it's definitely building traction, but perhaps it could be a stopping point at the kind of C-level, board level, is because you're essentially selling the concept of hunting and to almost try and guarantee that you might find something. But of course, as we know, there is no guarantee. What I would say, though, is that I would caveat that if anyone was to argue that threat hunting is not beneficial, I would look at the average number of days to detect and respond. So the mean time to detect and respond, I think the last I heard was something like 170 something days last year. So the chances are, if you were actively doing threat hunting, even just 1 day a week, the chances are, even with a small number of resources allocated to hunting, you're probably going to turn up something. It might not necessarily be a piece of, you know, a sophisticated attack even, but I don't believe that there's, I mean, this is just a personal belief, but I don't believe that there's any such thing as an unsuccessful threat hunt operation, because the chances are you're still going to turn up something, even if it's not necessarily an attack, because you're still going to learn by whatever results, you know, produced. I kind of touched on the HR side, but you do, of course, need to have ideally technically sharp people, but not necessarily technically sharp people, but just people that are enthusiastic and want to get more involved. You need to be a little bit mindful of how much time and resource it could potentially take up. You don't want to kind of set an unlimited amount of time to go off and look for a certain type of activity, for example. So that's obviously pertinent. And then obviously it relies on clean log and network data and a solid interpretation and understanding. And just from my own, you know, talking from my own experience, you know, we do quite often get, you know, customers that are asking questions about the interpretation of their log data, or why does this look how it does, or is this normal? And it all goes back to kind of knowing what normal is and doing your baselines, looking at your trends, looking at your top and bottom X's, and just really understanding your infrastructure. So going to move on to a quick demo now before we run out of time. So I'll probably just blitz through this really quickly. So just using, I'm going to use the LogRhythm tool because that's obviously the tool that I kind of use day to day. So really simple idea here. So we're going to do just a very simple hunt looking for internal PS exec usage by specifically our privileged users or sysadmins. So really simple thing to do. So we can go off and we can select our criteria, nothing too tricky about that. And then we can then start looking at the results. So what we've got here is the process started and stopped, which is just a metadata or common event that's been derived from the original log message. And then we have a host, which I'll just call PC2. So from this point on, we could probably pivot and we could go backwards or forwards in time. And the kind of to the left of the yellow highlighted section is kind of the marker point of where what the current time is, so we can go forward or backwards in time. So from here we're going to go forward in time, drilling specifically into the processes and services started in reference to our original PS exec hunting operation. So we'll get our results back, and again, looking at kind of generally top X types of graphs, we'll see some results. And what might be suspicious is psexec svc.exe, frocdump.exe, cmd.exe, but more worryingly that we have acdc1, which is effectively our domain controller. And obviously this isn't a real world scenario, but it's just a concept of being able to use existing tools to do very quick and efficient hunting. So we do a little bit more drilling, and we use, in this instance, Windows sysmon event logs. So as we all know, sysmon has a whole rich feature set of collect, you know, the ability to collect really rich event ID data. In this example, things like hashes. We actually have what we call an MP rule name, which is our message processing engine rule name. So we categorize a lot of this data automatically. But what we can see here being executed on the domain controller, potentially via psexec, is the hostname.exe. So, okay, we know it's a sysadmin because we were targeting our sysadmin group or privileged user groups when we started out this hunt. So at this stage, there doesn't seem to be anything necessarily untoward. As we move on through the hunt, though, we look and find procdump.exe. So procdump is an executable typically used for troubleshooting and generating memory dumps of a running process. So again, nothing necessarily untoward. We do see a user administrator, which does seem a little bit strange, but we'll carry on tracing the individual event IDs, and I'm going to skip some of this because there's a little bit of overlap here. So kind of what we've gathered so far is we know that psexec svc.exe was executed on the domain controller. We know that psexec was executed on the PC number 2. And we also know that CMD then spawned hostname and procdump. And we got most of this information, funnily enough, just from using sysmon logs and some of the other Windows security logs. Haven't obviously listed them all because we could be here for a lot longer. So at this stage, we can then start adding our evidence, and evidence in the form of actual log data. We can add case notes, and obviously it's a really, really good idea to document everything that you do. We could also hop across to Network Monitor and actually have a look at communications going backwards and forth between these two particular machines. So obviously this is probably a bad example, but even just by drilling into some of these histograms, you should be able to spot whether there's any spikes or anything abnormal that might be, for instance, network communications occurring out of hours, or just suddenly a surge of network traffic going from that particular machine to a domain controller. What we see when we drill in a little bit further, and kind of this is where kind of the benefit of collecting PCAP data comes in, is we automatically classify SMB traffic. So certain SMB commands, typically things like query directory, SMB write, query info, all of those types of commands are typical for a Windows server, typically talking to another Windows machine, or vice versa. And those are typically used to query volume, maybe server information, file share information, and so on. So kind of quick point really, obviously, to know thy protocols. So need to always make sure you've got the RFCs, as John kind of mentioned earlier, knowing your RFCs, or at least having access to the documentation. So anyway, as we drill into that particular file name metadata field for that particular SMB traffic, we see a bunch of information here, but what's really important that stands out is we have the traffic, the SMB traffic, as another confirmation in the digital footprint of the PC2 making a connection with psexec. And we also have the process IDs captured in that particular flow. And one thing that comes highlighted at the very bottom there is the fact that there's an lsass.dump file, which seems a little bit interesting. So we decide to have another look. This is going back to our web console dashboard. And here we can see again our object of lsass.dump. Now, without even having to jump over to the Netmon console, we could have done that just by staying in the web console dashboard. We could then pull down the PCAP and use our favorite tool, whether that's Wireshark or TCP dump and so on. But we get the IPs, the MAC addresses, and all the nice juicy, layer 2, layer 3, and so on from these from the logs and the network flow. So just kind of quick just to kind of wrap up what we're talking about really quickly. So we've just basically gathered a bunch of different SMB commands and various other artifacts so far. So nothing really at this stage Andrew, may necessarily warrant that an intruder has done anything malicious.
Hey, Andrew?
Yeah.
So you discovered the connection between this PC2 and the domain controller. Well, the original query was like, show me psexec being transferred. Correct? Was that the initial kind of like dive into this investigation?
Right. So exactly. So doing running PS exec, maybe you have a detection rule that might be triggering when a user executes PS exec, and maybe the customer or the end user kind of might look at the user only and think, yeah, that's fine, they're a sysadmin and nothing to be alarmed about. But the idea of the kind of the change of the kind of change of stance from being the reactive as opposed to proactive, threat hunting can kind of start to, or very quickly rather, reveal pieces of the story that you might not otherwise notice if you're just defensively responding.
We used to call those at Tenable, right? Never before seen events. So if a PC connected to domain control and ran PS exec, and like we've never seen that before. It kind of sounds like that's where your investigation started. Then you're like, well, there was this SMB traffic, and then there was some LSAS, and the investigation goes on from there. And I love the fact that you can kind of take notes on your investigation. That's a really big differentiator, something that I haven't seen certainly in open source tools yet.
Cool. So, like I say, at this stage, it doesn't necessarily indicate anything malicious. So again, we can use our pivot tool to go back in time and see, okay, what happened before all of this activity, was running between these two machines. So again, we this time look at the bottom process names running on that particular PC over the last 2 hours. We're also looking at process starts. So again, we see cmd.exe, psexec, and we see printer setup, x86.exe. Now, all this actually is events relating to the PC and the domain controller. So one might question, well, why is printer setup x86 making outbound connections to the domain controller? So again, looking just at regular Windows event logs, event ID 5156 for this one, we get IP and TCP UDP information. We obviously do classification out of the box, so things that simple things that people take for granted, but just being able to quickly drill into this data. So this is just a regular event ID for filtering platform allowed connection. We see our process name here with a process ID, and actually again correlating with our sysmon logs. And again, I'm a great believer in sysmon. I believe every company should be running it. We quickly discover that actually printer setup is not a printer setup; it's potentially Mimikatz. So grabbing the hash that we see in that particular event ID, and we can just copy and paste the hash into VirusTotal, or I'm all up for automation, so we can use Smart Response and actually automate this either automatically or just have a bit of more manual control over this. But we can actually integrate out of the box with VirusTotal, and if we saw a future occurrence, for instance, of this type of activity, we can actually just get the Smart Response to automatically go out and do the lookup and query against the VirusTotal database. So potentially at this stage, we know a little bit about Mimikatz, or we may know lots about Mimikatz. So it could be a golden ticket or a silver ticket or a curb roasting type of attack. And the AD security website, some great information from Sean. But in particular, just want to draw your attention to a couple of common, or at least for the majority of golden ticket types of attacks. So the account domain is a fully qualified domain name, but it should in fact be the short domain name. And for the event ID 4672, it should be blank. It should be short name, but it is in fact blank. So using that information, freely available information, we'll go out and have a look at these two particular event IDs. So on the left, we have 4624, and on the right, we have event ID 4672. And we see that in the domain impacted, we have the short name for both of them. So, okay, we don't hit the criteria. So does this mean that this isn't a golden ticket attack? And it kind of comes back to doing your own testing and making sure you understand how things look on your network. Because for this particular build of Mimikatz, it doesn't actually populate the domain name, with the fully qualified domain name. So it's just because by chance I happen to be using a newer version of Mimikatz. Drilling in a bit further, what we see, in fact, slightly different that isn't necessarily documented, is we see a user that's used administrator privileges to execute Mimikatz on the remote machine. And so using this information, we see that they do a network logon, they successfully authenticate. And looking, again, this isn't a great example, but if we had more information, we could potentially see, something, stand out in the trend graph. Again, we could use the network monitor dashboard to pull out further network communications. And actual fact, on that particular day, what they did in fact do was they pulled down Mimikatz from just a free file uploader, downloader website. So kind of all this kind of, that started out from something very simple can turn up, loads more results. And as I say, it doesn't always necessarily have to be malicious to kind of consider the threat hunt as, successful or not. It should not. I don't personally think threat hunting should be a success or failure, because ultimately you're always going to learn stuff about your infrastructure. So kind of just wrapping that up, lots of automation that can be included for a future hunt, because let's say, for example, you want to go and perform the same threat hunt against PS exec, against your sysadmins in another couple of months' time. Well, if you can automate some of this, and if you understand how some of this, for example, Mimikatz might look using JP Cert information, or using the attack matrix by MITRE and all the other great resources out there, eventually you can start automating not just your reactive detection, security detection day to day, but also your proactive threat hunting. And lots of things you can do there. Also, you can look at trend detection. So the more you understand about, for example, authentications within your organization, you can then start setting up trends or baselines, comparing, a moving average, say a 7 or 2 week average of logons to that particular domain controller, or even a group of domain controller. And also looking for patterns of behavior, so certain events that were observed or maybe not observed within an expected time frame. And just from my testing, and this is not as thorough as I would have liked it to be, but just from my own observations, kind of going back to JP Cert, we're currently working on JP Cert internally, seeing how we can incorporate that into a future module. But it goes to show that just, without actually going off and testing, even JP Cert has, it doesn't necessarily show the full picture for every single environment. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of document. You still, I still highly recommend you go and do as much testing as you can. But just for my test purposes, these were some of the event IDs that I found, that were repeating in my environment. And I'm sure, some of those would probably overlap. So yeah, there we go.
Awesome. Andrew, thank you so much.
No worries.
We have a couple of minutes, like literally 2 minutes for questions. You can, of course, submit questions to us via email, and we'll make sure we get those relayed to the appropriate parties as well. I'm sure one of the questions is, where are the slides? We will send you the slides. There may be a little more of a delay on the slides, as I stated to those joining the webcast a little earlier. Pretty much about half of our Security Weekly team is still stuck in Orlando due to weather conditions. So it may take a little longer to get the slides together. So John and Andrew's slides will be available to all of those who registered for this webcast, in addition to the video as well. So when you register for webcasts, we do provide you with all of the materials that are sent to you afterwards. So you can get those. If you have other questions, the best email that reaches the most people here at Security Weekly that are in a position to respond is psw@securityweekly.com. That's psw@securityweekly.com. That's kind of the general list that we have that includes all of us here that work for Security Weekly, in addition to all of the hosts that host all of our shows and webcasts. So psw@securityweekly.com. If you have questions, I don't think there were any. Someone asked about running Conza from a Unix box to collect all of this info. I'm not sure. John had to actually drop off. So I will have John post an answer to that question. If you want to email whoever asked that question, if you want to email it to us. Actually, we can see who, if they asked that question in GoToWebinar. We'll make sure we get you a response to that from John. I think Conza is just a Windows tool, though, Andrew. I don't know if you're familiar with that tool, though.
I thought it was just Windows, but I could be wrong.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, for watching and listening to this program today. Andrew, thank you very much for coming on and presenting. Thanks to John as well. And again, we're going to send out all of the resources for this webcast today to everyone who registered. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.